Picture this. A small, unassuming woman walks into one of the most prestigious courtrooms in Silicon Valley. Her clothes are simple. A modest black dress that's clearly been worn many times before, paired with shoes that have seen better days. Her hands shake slightly as she clutches a worn leather briefcase, and her eyes dart nervously around the mahogany-paneled room, filled with expensive suits and confident smirks. The opposing legal team? 3 of the most ruthless corporate attorneys money can buy, representing Zenith Technologies, a billion-dollar tech giant. They're lounging in their chairs like predators who've already tasted victory, whispering jokes and barely containing their laughter. The gallery is packed with journalists, tech executives, and curious onlookers who've come to witness what everyone assumes will be a massacre. What they don't know is that they're about to witness something else entirely, something that will shake the very foundations of their assumptions about power, justice, and the quiet strength that can lie beneath the most humble exterior. This is the story of Sarah Chen, and the moment she spoke her husband's name, everything changed forever. Sarah Chen had always been invisible. At 42, she possessed the kind of quiet presence that allowed her to blend into crowds, to observe without being observed. Her straight black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face, though kind, bore the lines of someone who had carried more than her share of life's burdens. As she entered courtroom 7B that crisp October morning, every eye turned to assess her. The whispers began immediately. "That's her? She's representing herself? This is going to be over in 10 minutes. Sarah heard them all. She'd been hearing whispers like these for months now, ever since she'd filed her wrongful termination lawsuit against Zenith Technologies. The media had dubbed it David versus Goliath, but even that comparison seemed generous. David, after all, had been a warrior. Sarah Chen was just a former software engineer who'd been unceremoniously fired from her job and was now trying to take on one of the most powerful corporations in America. Her story had started 18 months earlier when she'd discovered irregularities in Zenith's new AI surveillance software code that could potentially be used to spy on American citizens without their knowledge. When she'd raised concerns through proper channels, she'd been labeled a troublemaker. When she'd persisted, she'd been fired for performance issues and cultural misalignment. Now Sarah sat alone at the plaintiff's table, dwarfed by the imposing presence of Zenith's legal team. Lead counsel Marcus Whitmore was a legend in corporate law, a silver-haired shark who'd never lost a case this significant. His associates, Jennifer Walsh and David Park, were equally formidable, their designer suits and confident demeanor radiating the kind of power that came from winning at all costs. "Your Honor," Whitmore began, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "We're here today because Ms. Chen has made some rather fantastical claims about my client. Claims that, frankly, seem to stem from a disgruntled employee's inability to accept legitimate workplace feedback." Judge Margaret Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s, peered over her glasses at the proceedings. She'd seen countless cases like this, small individuals crushed beneath the weight of corporate machinery. While she maintained judicial neutrality, there was something in Sarah's quiet dignity that caught her attention. "Miss Chen," Judge Harrison said, "you understand that you're representing yourself in this matter? You've declined our offers to provide court-appointed counsel?" Sarah stood, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I can adequately represent my own interests." A snicker rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back row muttered, "This is painful to watch." Whitmore smiled, the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse. "Your Honor, if I may, we'd like to expedite these proceedings. Ms. Chen's claims are entirely without merit, and frankly, this case represents a frivolous use of the court's time." What followed was 3 hours of methodical humiliation. Whitmore and his team presented their case with the precision of a Swiss watch, painting Sarah as an unreliable employee who'd been given multiple chances to improve her performance before being let go. They called witness after witness, Sarah's former supervisor, who testified that she'd been difficult to work with and resistant to feedback, her former colleagues, who claimed she'd been paranoid and disruptive, even the HR director, who presented a carefully curated file of performance reviews that painted Sarah as incompetent and insubordinate. Each testimony felt like a dagger to Sarah's heart, not because it was true, but because she could see how convincing it sounded. These people had once been her friends, her teammates. Now they sat in the witness chair, looking anywhere but at her, reciting lines that had clearly been rehearsed. Mrs. Chen consistently missed deadlines, testified Robert Kumar, her former team lead. She would spend hours questioning perfectly standard code implementations, claiming they were somehow unethical. It became disruptive to the entire team's productivity. Sarah scribbled notes furiously, her hands trembling slightly. She knew the truth, that those standard implementations had been backdoors for government surveillance, that her missed deadlines had been the result of her refusing to compromise her ethical standards. But sitting in this courtroom, listening to the testimony, she could see how the jury was reacting. Their faces were skeptical, dismissive. They'd already made up their minds. During the lunch recess, Sarah sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, unwrapping a sandwich she'd made at home. She couldn't afford to eat at the expensive restaurants where Zenith's legal team was undoubtedly celebrating their morning victory. A young journalist approached her. Katie Morrison from Tech Daily, one of the few reporters who's shown any interest in Sarah's side of the story. "How are you holding up?" Katie asked gently. Sarah looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I knew it would be difficult, but I didn't expect them to make me sound like a crazy person." "You're not crazy," Katie said firmly. "I've looked into your claims, the code you discovered. If it's real, it's a massive violation of privacy rights." "If it's real?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Katie, I have the documentation, I have the proof. But who's going to believe me now? Look at me. I'm just a single mother who couldn't even afford a lawyer. They're making me look like a delusional conspiracy theorist." Katie sat beside her. "Sometimes the most important battles are fought by the most unlikely warriors. Don't give up." As they walked back into the courthouse, Sarah felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. She was David facing Goliath, but her sling felt broken, and her stones felt like pebbles. The afternoon session was even worse. Whitmore brought in character witnesses, executives who testified to Zenith's sterling reputation and commitment to privacy rights. He presented technical experts who dismissed Sarah's concerns as the misunderstandings of a mid-level programmer who didn't grasp the complexities of modern software architecture. "Your Honor," Whitmore said during his presentation, "Mrs. Chen's allegations are not just wrong, they're dangerously irresponsible. She's essentially accusing one of America's most trusted technology companies of engaging in illegal surveillance activities. These are the paranoid fantasies of someone who couldn't accept legitimate workplace criticism." The gallery murmured in agreement. Even Judge Harrison looked skeptical as she reviewed the mountain of evidence Zenith had presented. Performance reviews, witness statements, technical documents that seemed to contradict every claim Sarah had made. Sarah's cross-examinations were painful to watch. Her voice remained steady, but she lacked the theatrical flair and legal expertise to effectively challenge the witnesses. When she questioned the technical expert about the surveillance capabilities of the code, he dismissed her with condescending explanations that made her sound like an amateur. "Miss Chen," the expert said with barely concealed disdain, "what you're describing simply isn't how modern encryption protocols work. I think you may have misunderstood the function of the code modules you examined." "I've been programming for 15 years, Sarah replied quietly. "I know the difference between legitimate security protocols and surveillance backdoors." "With respect, Ms. Chen, your employment record suggests otherwise." The laughter from the gallery was louder this time. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she pressed on. By 4 o'clock, it was clear that Sarah had lost. The jury looked bored, The judge looked sympathetic but resigned, and Zenith's legal team looked like they were already planning their victory celebration. Whitmore stood for his closing argument, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what we've witnessed today is a perfect example of why our legal system must protect honest companies from vindictive former employees. Ms. Chen had every opportunity to succeed at Zenith Technologies. Instead, she chose to fabricate elaborate conspiracy theories rather than accept responsibility for her own shortcomings." He gestured dismissively toward Sarah. "Look at her, ladies and gentlemen. Does she look like someone who could uncover a massive corporate conspiracy that somehow escaped the notice of dozens of senior engineers, multiple government oversight agencies, and the most sophisticated legal department in Silicon Valley?" The implication was clear and cruel. Sarah was too small, too ordinary, too insignificant to be taken seriously. "We ask that you reject Ms. Chen's baseless claims and award my client damages for the reputational harm caused by this frivolous lawsuit." The courtroom fell silent as Whitmore returned to his seat, his confidence radiating through the room like heat from a fire. Judge Harrison looked at Sarah with something approaching pity. "Miss Chen, you have the right to make a closing statement. Would you like to address the court?" Sarah stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her worn briefcase in her hand, and faced the jury. For a long moment she said nothing, simply looking at each face in turn. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the courtroom, every word carried. "Members of the jury, Your Honor, I know how this looks. I know what you're thinking. You're looking at me and seeing exactly what Mr. Whitmore wants you to see. A bitter, former employee who can't accept the truth about her own failures." She paused, her hands steady now for the first time all day. "Maybe I am ordinary. Maybe I am just a small person trying to fight something much bigger than myself. But being ordinary doesn't mean being wrong, and being small doesn't mean being insignificant." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a single photograph, an old, slightly faded picture of a man in a military uniform. "I want to tell you about my husband," she said, her voice growing stronger. "His name was Daniel Chen." The name hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Whitmore's confident smile faltered. Judge Harrison sat up straighter. Even the bored-looking jury members suddenly focused their attention. "Perhaps some of you remember that name," Sarah continued. "Daniel Chen was a cybersecurity specialist with the NSA. 15 years ago, he discovered that several major tech companies were cooperating with illegal government surveillance programs that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens." The courtroom was dead silence now. Every person present understood the significance of what Sarah was saying. Daniel Chen had been a whistleblower whose revelations had led to congressional hearings, corporate prosecutions, and major reforms in government surveillance practices. "My husband tried to expose these programs through proper channels, just like I tried to expose what I found at Zenith. And just like me, he was dismissed, discredited, and ultimately silenced." Sarah's voice broke slightly, but she continued. "Daniel was killed in a car accident 2 years after he came forward. The official investigation concluded it was just that, an accident. But Daniel had been receiving death threats for months. He'd been followed, harassed, and systematically destroyed professionally. Just like they're trying to do to me." Whitmore was on his feet now. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the case at hand. Ms. Chen is trying to prejudice the jury with unsubstantiated conspiracy theories about—" "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said sharply. "Mr. Chen, please continue." Sarah reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder. "Before Daniel died, he gave me something. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would use it to continue his work." She held up the folder, her hands no longer shaking. "This contains documentation of every surveillance program Daniel uncovered, including detailed technical specifications for exactly the kind of backdoor code I found in Zenith software." The change in the courtroom's atmosphere was palpable. Whitmore looked pale, his associates were whispering frantically among themselves, and the gallery was buzzing with excited murmurs. "You want to know how I, an ordinary software engineer, could recognize sophisticated surveillance code? Because my husband spent the last 2 years of his life teaching me exactly what to look for. Because he knew that companies like Zenith would continue to cooperate with illegal surveillance programs, and he wanted to make sure someone would be able to stop them." Sarah walked closer to the jury box, her presence commanding now in a way it hadn't been all day. "Daniel Chen died trying to protect your privacy, your rights, your freedom, and when I found the same kind of code he'd spent his life fighting against, I knew I had to continue his work, no matter the cost." She turned to face Whitmore directly. "Mr. Whitmore, you asked the jury to look at me and decide whether I'm capable of uncovering a massive corporate conspiracy. You're right. I'm not. But my husband was, and he already did the work. I'm just finishing what he started." The revelation transformed everything. Sarah was no longer the pathetic figure who'd been mocked and dismissed all day. She was the widow of a national hero, carrying on his legacy of protecting American freedom. But she wasn't finished. "I have more than just my husband's research," Sarah said, reaching into her briefcase one final time. "I have something else." She pulled out a small digital recorder and held it up for everyone to see. 3 days before I was fired, I recorded a conversation with my supervisor, Robert Kumar, the same man who testified this morning that I was paranoid and disruptive. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, do you wish to present this recording as evidence?" "I do, Your Honor." The courtroom held its breath as Sarah connected the recorder to the sound system. Kumar, who had been sitting in the gallery, looked like he was about to be sick. The recording was crystal clear. Kumar's voice filled the courtroom. "Sarah, I need you to stop asking questions about the Night Watch protocols. I know they look suspicious, but we're under direct orders from the NSA to implement them exactly as specified." Sarah's voice on the recording. "Robert, these aren't security protocols. They're surveillance backdoors. If we implement this code, the government will be able to access any device running our software without a warrant." Kumar's voice again. "I know what they are, Sarah, we all know, but this is a multi-billion-dollar contract. If we don't cooperate, Zenith loses the contract and we all lose our jobs. Just implement the code and keep your mouth shut." The silence that followed was deafening. Kumar had fled the courtroom. Whitmore was frantically shuffling through papers, his confidence completely shattered. Sarah stood in the center of the courtroom, no longer the nervous, insignificant woman who'd walked in that morning. She was a warrior now, armed with truth and motivated by love for a husband who'd died defending the Constitution. "Members of the jury," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "Zenith Technologies didn't fire me for poor performance. They fired me because I discovered they were participating in illegal surveillance activities, and I refused to stay silent about it." She gestured toward the empty chair where Kumar had been sitting. "You heard the truth from his own mouth. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway because it was profitable." Sarah walked back to her table and pulled out a stack of documents. "I have technical specifications for the Night Watch protocols. I have email exchanges between Zenith executives discussing the surveillance capabilities. I have financial records showing payments from NSA shell companies. I have everything you need to understand that this isn't the fantasy of a disgruntled employee. It's the reality of a corporation that chose profit over principle." The jury was riveted now, hanging on her every word. The dismissive skepticism of the morning had been replaced by intense attention and growing outrage. Daniel Chen died, believing that the American people deserved to know when their government was spying on them illegally. He died believing that corporations couldn't be allowed to profit from the erosion of our constitutional rights. He died believing that ordinary people like me could make a difference if we had the courage to stand up and tell the truth. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, listen to the recordings, read the documents, and then ask yourself, do you want to live in a country where corporations can spy on you with impunity, where whistleblowers are destroyed for telling the truth, where the powerful can silence the weak simply by mocking their appearance or questioning their credentials? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. Because that's what this case is really about. It's not about whether Sarah Chen was a good employee. It's about whether we're going to let fear and intimidation stop us from protecting the freedoms that people like my husband died defending. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim but determined. The foreman, a middle-aged man who'd looked bored and dismissive that morning, now regarded Sarah with something approaching reverence. "We find in favor of the plaintiff Sarah Chen on all counts," he announced. "We award damages in the amount of $50 million for wrongful termination, emotional distress, and punitive damages against Zenith Technologies." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for their phones, gallery members cheered, and Zenith's legal team sat in stunned silence. Zenith sat silent, but the monetary award wasn't the real victory. Within hours of the verdict, the Department of Justice announced a criminal investigation into Zenith's surveillance practices. The NSA began a review of all contracts with technology companies. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Most importantly, Sarah's courage had inspired others. Within days, employees from dozens of tech companies came forward with their own evidence of illegal surveillance programs. The domino effect that Daniel Chen had started with his original whistleblowing was finally reaching its full potential. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same courthouse. But this time she wasn't alone. Katie Morrison, the young journalist who'd befriended her, was by her side, along with a dozen other whistleblowers who'd found the courage to come forward. They were there for the sentencing of Zenith's executives, who'd pled guilty to conspiracy charges related to the surveillance program. Robert Kumar had received immunity in exchange for his testimony, but he'd lost his career and his reputation. "How does it feel?" Katie asked as they watched the executives being led away in handcuffs. Sarah thought for a moment, her hand unconsciously touching the simple gold wedding ring she still wore. "It feels like Daniel can finally rest in peace," she said quietly. "He always believed that the truth would win in the end, but he never got to see it happen. Now he has." Sarah had used her settlement money to establish the Daniel Chen Foundation for Government Transparency, providing legal support for whistleblowers and funding investigations into corporate surveillance practices. She had also returned to school to study law, determined to become the kind of advocate for justice that she'd needed during her darkest hour. "You know what the most important thing was?" Sarah said as they walked down the courthouse steps. "It wasn't the money or the vindication, or even seeing those executives go to prison. It was the moment when I said Daniel's name and everything changed." She paused, looking back at the courthouse where she'd been mocked and dismissed just months before. "For the first 18 months after he died, I felt like Daniel's sacrifice had been meaningless. The surveillance programs continued, the corporations got richer, and ordinary people like me felt powerless to change anything. But that day in court, I realized that his legacy wasn't gone. It was just waiting for someone to carry it forward." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since Daniel's death, it was a smile of genuine happiness rather than polite courtesy. "They laughed at me because they thought I was nobody. They thought being ordinary meant being powerless. But they were wrong. Sometimes the most extraordinary changes come from the most ordinary people. People who refuse to stay silent when they witness injustice. People who choose courage over comfort. People who understand that doing the right thing is more important than being safe." Today, the Daniel Chen Foundation has helped expose surveillance programs in over 24 companies. Sarah has testified before Congress, consulted with the Department of Justice, and become one of the most respected voices in the fight for digital privacy rights. But she's still the same humble woman who walked into that courtroom 4 years ago. She still drives the same used car, still lives in the same modest apartment, and still makes her own sandwiches for lunch. The difference is that now she knows something she didn't know then. Being ordinary doesn't mean being powerless. Being small doesn't mean being insignificant. And sometimes, the most important battles are won not by the loudest voices or the biggest weapons, but by quiet courage and unwavering dedication to the truth. Every day, Sarah receives emails from people around the world who've been inspired by her story. Workers who found the courage to report unsafe conditions. Citizens who've demanded accountability from their elected officials. Ordinary people who've realized that they, too, have the power to make extraordinary changes. And every day, Sarah remembers that moment in the courtroom when she spoke her husband's name and watched the powerful realize that they weren't as untouchable as they'd believed. Daniel always said that tyranny depends on good people staying silent. Sarah often tells audiences when she speaks at conferences and universities, the moment we find our voices, the moment we refuse to be intimidated or dismissed, that's the moment everything changes. The story of Sarah Chen proves that heroes don't always wear capes or carry weapons. Sometimes they carry worn briefcases and speak in quiet voices. Sometimes they're the people who get laughed at, dismissed, and underestimated, right up until the moment they change the world. 5 years after that transformative day in court, Sarah Chen stood before the Supreme Court of the United States, preparing to argue the most important case of her legal career. The girl who had once been laughed at in a Silicon Valley courtroom was now representing 50 million Americans in a class-action lawsuit against the federal government itself. The case, Chen v. United States, challenged the constitutionality of mass surveillance programs that had been exposed through her foundation's work. As Sarah adjusted her simple black suit, the same one she'd worn to countless hearings since that first day, she thought about how far she'd traveled from that moment of humiliation. The marble corridors of the Supreme Court echoed with whispers, but these were different whispers than before. Now, law students and civil rights advocates spoke her name with reverence. "That's Sarah Chen," she heard a young woman tell her friend. "She's the one who brought down the surveillance state." In the gallery sat Katie Morrison, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, whose coverage of Sarah's case had sparked a global movement for digital privacy rights. Beside her were dozens of former tech employees, who had found the courage to speak truth to power after witnessing Sarah's transformation. But the most meaningful presence was an empty chair in the front row, a chair Sarah had reserved for Daniel. She carried his photograph everywhere now, not as a burden of grief, but as a reminder of the legacy they were building together. As Chief Justice Roberts called the court to order, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nerves that had once paralyzed her, but now she understood something crucial. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite that fear. "Your Honors," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "5 years ago, I was laughed at for suggesting that ordinary citizens deserved protection from corporate surveillance. Today, I stand before you representing not just those 50 million Americans, but every person who believes that dignity and privacy are not privileges to be granted by the powerful, but rights to be protected by the law." The justices leaned forward, captivated. Sarah smiled slightly, remembering Daniel's words. The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. In that moment, she knew that every laugh, every dismissal, every moment of humiliation had led to this: the chance to protect millions of people who would never know her name, but whose freedom would be secured by her courage. The girl they had laughed at had become the woman who would change history.